Well, hello and welcome to our conversation today. I'm Kent Lassman, the president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and momentarily we'll be joined by my colleague Joel Zinberg and Professor Casey Mulligan, the author of You're Hired, Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. Joel is the senior fellow with us here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're very fortunate to recruit him early this year after he completed a 2-year stint as an economist and general counsel to the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He holds a law degree from Yale and taught for a decade at Columbia University Law School. In addition, after earning a medical degree from Columbia, he practiced general and oncologic surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital for nearly 30 years. Professor Mulligan joins us from the University of Chicago, where he returned after a sabbatical, during which he served as the chief economist to the CEA from 2018 to 2019. Our topic today generally is regulatory economics, but specifically we'll look at Casey's memoir from that important period of policymaking. With less than a month before we conclude national elections, all the chatter appears to focus on politics. But it's important that we don't take our eyes off the central issue of the policies that are enacted by the federal government and the sausage making that goes into their development. You're Hired provides a candid account of how economic analysis informs and sometimes drives major changes to the lives of Americans. It includes turf fights, a model for understanding contemporary presidential communications, reflections on policy failures, and the untold story of a robot. There's a little something for everyone. I hope you'll join us today in 2 important ways. First, I'd like to interject your questions to the conversation. To do so, I need you to email me at events@cei.org or use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. Second, at the end of the forum, you'll be prompted to give us feedback in a short survey. It should take less than a minute, and it helps us keep improving. So a healthy, hearty welcome to both of you. Thank you for making time to talk about You're Hired and the time that the 2 of you spent working in upper echelons of White House policymaking. Before we dive straight into the book, Casey, I'm hoping that you can give us all a refresher on the Council of Economic Advisors. You note in the book that the law calls for the CEA to foster and promote free and competitive enterprise. Now that sounds like my kind of place. What happens there, and where does it fit into the federal government?
Yeah, CEA was established, I believe, at the same time as the Joint Economic Committee long ago by Congress to, you might say its main job is to write the economic report of the president, which I believe in the early years was semi-annual, but it became annual. And then also to advise the president on those sorts of issues. So we did not consider ourselves, and I don't think Congress consider us policy making. We're not an agency. We don't make regulations or help disperse the government money or collect taxes or anything like that. We're also, another thing is unusual, this is not part of the statute, but it's become a tradition. It's heavily staffed by academics, so it's rotating. You mentioned that Joel was there for 2 years. I was there for a year. And that brings strengths and weaknesses. We don't have institutional capital, which again has strengths and weaknesses. We might not know our way around that well, but we bring in a fresh perspective, and that really had an influence. Now in this administration, the president and his staff were, I think, particularly interested in economics, so we did get involved, you might say even invited to policy making. I think Rich Burkhauser was in the audience today, and he was involved with making an immigration plan. Kevin was involved with making policies around Middle East economics. Joel was involved in kidney markets type of policies, and I could go on and on. That's not our normal function, but I guess our expertise and what we brought to the table was appreciated and wanted, so we ended up getting involved in some of those things.
You make I think a poignant observation that's really quick to gloss over. you referred to it just now, and it's explicit in the book. I think in the preface or the introduction early in the book, you make a comment that the federal government is an organization that is too vast for any single individual to really understand how it operates. And so in that way, part of the answer there, and part of what I hear, is the CEA and this council of outside experts or oftentimes academic experts who come into the White House, they serve as giving a method for analyzing big questions, big overlapping jurisdictions and big problems of the nation, and provide that sort of advice to the president and his cabinet officials. Is that fair? Both that the federal government's too big and too big to understand, as well as in an absolute sense, and that's what the core function is to provide that methodology?
Yes, it's. I was really struck on how massive the government is, and I had the privilege of talking to, for example, the regulatory czars in various previous administrations, who were supposed to know all about the regulations. And the reason I approached them is because they were saying stuff about regulation that was not generally true. And I talked to them and I realized there's so much regulation going on, for example, that even the regulatory czar doesn't really know what's happening. And until I pointed things out to them, and then they sat back and said, oh yeah, I guess you're right. I kind of forgotten about that. You know, that it's such a vast territory that even very smart people can't wrap their mind around it.
It's also worth emphasizing that juxtaposed with this vast bureaucracy of the government, CEA is actually quite small. It varies between about 30 to 40 people at any one time. So, you know, people there are putting on a lot of different hats. They're stretching themselves, and thankfully they are usually uniformly pretty bright group of people, so they can stretch themselves and cover lots of different interest areas.
Joel, I want to put you to the test here, because I do want to get us right into the book. You've known Casey, you've worked with Casey, you worked with dozens and dozens of other economists. As you said, there's upwards of 30 people at the council. What did you learn from the book?
Well, what I learned from the book is I think sort of Casey crystallized the decision-making process and the marketing process that the president goes through. And I think he did it in a way that I wasn't really, I think I was vaguely aware of, but I think he really kind of hit the nail on the head. So
here you're talking about the public rallies and the way the speeches evolve over time. You're talking about the Twitter feed and the use of, there's a compelling anecdote here about the briefing that you did for the president on a new economic report of the president, and a leading chart that, you know, how that tweet evolved from concept to implementation. Is that what you're talking about here, Joel, or is there more to it? The marketing, you said.
No, well, I think the idea that there's a real method to the madness, that some of the seemingly outrageous behavior and exaggerations and that one sees either in speeches or in Twitter is just a method of experimenting and trying out different policy choices and throwing it up and seeing what sticks and then adapting. And I think people do not give President Trump the credit he deserves for being flexible and sort of understanding the problem and then exploring ways to deal with it through these various mechanisms of the Twitter and the public statements, and then adapting the policy when he sees how that flies.
Now, there's a big kind of topic here to chew on that I think explores this model of experimentation, Casey, that you have, that you use through the book. And that is the rebate rule with the Department of Health and Human Services. This is something that Secretary Azar and his team were driving. The CEA had different analysis. Could you walk us through how that policy evolved, and in particular, your understanding, your model of understanding this experimentation that the president has used.
Sure. Yeah, and just a little background. Most regulation is coming from the Department of Health and Human Services. Got nothing to do with smokestacks and water and all that stuff. It's coming from there, and they have a long regulatory tradition there. And the current secretary, who was the secretary when I was there, he had a great resume. He had worked in that department before. He's a regulator. I mean, that's how he approached problems, and he wanted to help the president, who wanted to lower prescription drug prices. So he's trying to think of ways of having regulation, price controls of various kinds to bring down prescription drug prices. And he had a complicated, also not clear it's legal, but that's not my area, complicated scheme for regulating the prices that drug manufacturers pay to health insurance plans and their representatives. And those are called rebates. Drug manufacturers don't like to pay rebates because they want to get all the money from the customer. They don't want to have to be rebating any money. And it was funny when Joel took me to my first meeting about this. It was actually my first meeting about any regulation. And the guys from the health, the secretary's people presenting this plan to the White House, they were bragging about how the president of Pfizer thought this was a great regulation. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, the White House itself was filled with people who want to drain the swamp. And then we're hearing how big pharma loves the regulation that would allow them to collect more money. And it didn't occur to them. I mean, that's how different the culture is. That department is, like many agencies, regulation is their solution to everything. And our view was, maybe a little freedom would lower costs and prices. So we had very much a battle there. The Office of Management Budget, also in the White House, also was very passionate against this, largely because it was going to raise, because these rebates wouldn't be happening, health plans would be losing money to the pharma companies. And one of the biggest health plans is Medicare Part D, prescription drug plans. So that was going to cost the Treasury a lot of money. And OMB may not look like it from the outside, but they are passionate about fighting for every taxpayer dollar that they can. This is the regulation.
I'm going to have to take your word for it on that. I want to believe you. I think that's more true sometimes than others, and maybe not so true right now.
So they were fighting on that tooth and nail. So we had the kind of battle lines drawn. We had the economists and the budget people wanting to stop this regulation, and the health secretary claiming that it would fulfill the president's campaign promises, and the president had to settle this dispute. And I remember this is one where I was invited to the Oval Office, partly because it's such a darn complicated regulation that I had done so much work on it. And we were there, and of course we were both rooting for our own sides. I was hoping the president would go with us, and I'm sure the secretary is hoping the president would go with him. And then when he opened my eyes, and I realized he's not going to do neither. It's like a Solomon type of character, maybe. He wanted to let the regulation continue in the process to get comments. And that's what he wanted. And we got 28,000 comments from the public. And it's so surprising because previous administrations hate the comments, because that's when, they got their reg that they want to get in there. And if it causes people harm, they don't want to give people a platform for articulating that harm. But he wanted to hear, well, what are the harms? What are the benefits? He wanted to hear from the people. And he thought that comment process is a virtue rather than a bug. And then when the comments came in, that together with kind of playing with this with, I think, people he knows, and at rallies, he talked about this rebate rule. And between the comments and the kind of feedback he got from his 10,000 person focus group up in Green Bay, he decided this really is a dumb idea, the way the economists described it to me, and we're going to put it to bed. Now, it did make a comeback just a couple months ago, an executive order. He put out an executive order, said we're going to ban rebates. But he said in order to do that, the secretary has to prove that the harms that we in OMB articulated, namely more tax dollars, higher premiums for seniors, more money for pharma, the secretary has to prove that those harms won't happen. And so we'll see. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know, how that's going to play out. I suspect that rule really is dead, and the president just wants to remind people how passionate he is about trying to get prescription drug prices down.
Yeah, I think this is a real good example of the virtues of CEA and the contribution it makes, because the secretary had a great number of initiatives in the drug pricing area, and he would present them to us. And I had a few different meetings in my office with some very high level people from HHS, and I just didn't understand what they were saying. It didn't make much sense. And I said, I couldn't conceive of why the market had evolved in a certain way and why they wanted to change it and what sense it made. And the answers I got were, well, we know better. We've been here before, or we've worked in the industry, and we know that this is the way it should be done. Or as Casey said, the president of Pfizer told us this is a good idea. And no matter what I would say, they could not give me a sort of anything that was, a reasonable answer. So I figured I'm just an old country doctor. I need a really smart economist in here. And that's when I recruited Casey to come in. And both CEA and OMB were really interested in the policy process and understanding why had the market evolved the way it had and what was going to be the impact of these changes. And those were, that process of CEA figuring that out and then being able to advise the president, I think, was very important in squelching a bad set of policies.
So here we have business-to-business price controls. Generally we're got lots of evidence that price controls are going to have all sorts of negative effects, negative unintended consequences. A rule proposed that, as Casey, you said, the president allowed the agency to move it into the comment period. A rule that would nearly $200 billion worth of costs, $196 billion, I think was the estimate. I think you guys are underselling it. So I'm going to read a single paragraph, a single passage to dramatize a little bit of the spiciness of the book, but to really get at some of the turf wars here, because I think it's an important point to make about how much is at stake behind the scenes and the role that economic analysis can play. So this comes from the book, page 147. Casey, you write, a sharply dressed bearded man stood up near the door of the White House meeting room and bellowed, HHS, you need to hear OMB loud and clear. Your AKS RIA is DOA, and exited the meeting. As several others filed out of the room behind him, I leaned toward CEA's general counsel, Joel Zinberg, and whispered, that must be a world record for a number of acronyms in one sentence. What the hell does it mean? Joel chuckled and said, I have no idea, except that we're going to enjoy working with that guy. Now, the acronyms refer to the agency, OMB, the budget office. Dead on arrival would be the regulatory impact analysis. Is this common? Economic policies, did the Trump White House, in your experiences on economic issues, have a lot of headbutting? Or was there generally a sense that you all had pointed the same direction and understood the values and the mission that the president had set out for the team? This is a softer way to get to that question about, was it regular order or was it chaotic over there at the White House? Sometimes it's hard to tell from the outside.
Well, those are distinct questions. I mean, as I said, the agencies in general, and particularly that agency, regulation is the solution to problems. And the philosophy of the president and many of the people that he brought with him is, maybe some freedom, and getting federal government out of the way is a solution to problems. So there was a fundamental disagreement there. Now, I give Brian Braze a heck of a lot of credit. He was special assistant to the president for economic policy, especially health policy, he put together a joint statement of principles about choice and competition. And Joel worked a lot on that, which really articulated the way the president feels about these things and the people he brought in. And that was helpful in those battles, that when we, not particularly in the rebate rule, but in general, when they would have an idea on limiting choice and competition, we would say, but wait, we all agreed. We wrote this statement of principle with many concrete examples about how we want our regulatory approach to enhance choice and enhance competition, not to block it. So that was kind of so that's not chaos at all. That was designed from the beginning. That choice and competition report came pretty early, and it kind of laid down a runway for us to manage these disagreements going forward.
Okay. You mentioned there Brian Blaze. He did a lot of work at one of our allied organizations at the Mercatus Center. Earlier, you referenced some other folks in the policy community. How important was it for the two of you to have that community, that deregulatory community or that economic analysis community available to you? The book has, at the end of each chapter, I found very helpful kind of for further reading and annotated, almost like an annotated bibliography that refers to friends and allies that I see all over town and all over the country. But under the pressure of the day-to-day work, how useful was that sort of community and input?
I mean, that's tremendously useful. I mean, you could say that's a main function of the CEA. It's complementary with writing the economic report, but also with everything we do. There's research out there, data files that have been gathered, and we relied on those very heavily. Kevin's address to the American Economic Association at the meetings was very much in the tax area. How the main thing that CEA was doing around the tax cuts was to go out in the literature and what was published about various business taxes and their effects and investment and all that stuff, and how that was the cornerstone of what we were doing. And without that cornerstone, I guess we would have next to nothing.
Can you explain? I was surprised. Maybe I should not have been, but I was surprised. You just used this reference of we went out into the literature. But there's a couple examples here of very prominent academics. And in particular, I'm thinking of Larry Summers, who has both achieved great success in the academy and in public service. People were brazenly walking back a common understanding of how economics works and their own textbooks in order to throw up roadblocks to what you were doing or what the White House policy agenda was. Can you walk us through that? I don't think I'm doing justice to the anecdotes that you share in the book.
Yeah, but I mean, as I said, the cornerstone of what we were doing was the research, okay? And, we read it in the journals, working paper series, Mercatus working paper series, what have you. And then we rely on it. And now the president's relying on some professor's publication, and that professor don't like Trump, to make an understatement. They hate Trump. And so they apparently, by revealed preference, they decide, I'd rather walk back my own research than give any support to this president. And Larry Summers did that in particular. He denied the whole concept of deadweight cost. He denied that the cost of a tax to the taxpayers could exceed the amount of revenue that the Treasury gets from that tax. And it was very clear what his motivation was.
I would comment, though, that I think this particular CEA was encouraged by Kevin Hassett, our chairman, and all the other members and senior people like Casey to go to the literature and do the research and find basis for our policy advice, that we weren't just supposed to be ideologues, we were supposed to actually give advice that had some basis in the literature. And I can tell you on the chapters that I was the primary author on the health chapters of the economic report of the president, and I think all the other chapters, we were really intent on making sure that we did a thorough discussion, a thorough literature search, and that everything we said had a basis. And I think that that was something that this CEA was a little bit different than some of the prior CEAs. You could look at some of those economic report of the presidents from prior years, and they were more like political statements than serious analysis.
You know, one thing that we learned from that Summers episode, that was pretty early, that we were going to rely, especially one we were relying on hard, you know, we would contact the author first and say, do you still stand by your paper? Before they knew how the president was going to use it. Do you stand by the arithmetic? And I had some of those phone calls I made myself. And we got it straight, what their paper, what they, in hindsight, they think their paper means. And then we didn't have that problem again. They didn't walk back. But that was kind of a preemptive step we were taking. To not only read their paper, but call them up and ask whether they still believe it.
Yeah. And it was actually kind of eye-opening. I know CEA had a paper about the risk of pandemics. This was back in September of 2019. I think we were very prescient in putting that out. And I can tell you, we did some of the same stuff in writing that paper and going back to the authors and saying, you wrote this and what did you mean by that? And I must say it was a little discouraging because often the authors had no recollection. And it made me wonder if they indeed had written the original paper or they, you know, delegated it to somebody else. But we really tried very hard to completely understand what they had done because we wanted to use their work and our work and make sure that we had a good academic product.
I want to pick up on this, this notion of really understanding and reading others' work with my next question about Paul Krugman. But before I get there, I want to remind everyone in the audience to take part in the conversation. Just tap the button at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A button, and those questions will get fed into me and we can make sure that Casey addresses them before we're done here. So you mentioned in the book that you made a habit of reading Professor Krugman, New York Times columnist Krugman, his Twitter feed. Why did you do that? What was the thinking behind trying to understand where he was tweeting?
You know, it was actually served a double purpose. So he could have been two people and it would have been okay. But, you know, international trade was a big issue in the Trump years. And Krugman is really good at explaining that area. So I felt that I was keeping myself limber, in my mind limber in that area by following what he had to say. Then anything else that wasn't international trade, it was pretty much wrong. And the reason I wanted to be aware of it, because his arguments are seductive to the president's opponents. Even if they don't read it from him, it's kind of a way of thinking. And so we could know what the president's opponents were going to say about whatever CEA product was going to come out before they said it. And that way we could be ready. You know, we could preempt it in the report. What I did a number of times is create a Q&A document. You know, what are the dumb questions that the reporters are going to ask? And so just any staff member at CEA could just open that Q&A document, find the Q, and read out the A. And that really made our life easy. I mean, if you're trying to deal with fresh questions on the fly, it's pretty inefficient. And you have a scramble in the office and you get a lot of personnel devoted to it. And this much more automated the process and allowed us to continue our attention on our new stuff.
Casey, we have a very observant audience member. A question comes in from Colin, and he notes your background. The backdrop for your Zoom photo there is a photo that I think appears at near the end of the book here. But he says, Dr. Mulligan's screen background seems to be a nod to the Jones Act. Colin is correct, which he effectively describes as a policy disaster in the book's final chapter. In a review of the book, John Cochran says that to figure out how to reform America, figure out how to get rid of the Jones Act. So the question for you is, how do we get rid of the Jones Act, or even modest reforms at it? What did you learn that can be applied to these efforts to repeal the Jones Act? And why does such a small industry enjoy so much support in Washington despite its demonstrable, evidentially based failures for the American people?
Well, wait a second, those are my questions. Colin, you can't ask me those. Those are my questions. You know, I was amazed at how proximate the special interests were to the policy process. I knew I could read regulations, I could see the special interests wrote them, but I didn't realize how close they were following what we were doing. And in this case, they were right at the resolute desk in the persons of the Secretary of Transportation, who has come from a shipping family, and Peter Navarro. So they were literally feet away from the president pushing that case. The Jones Act's 100 years old. It's the type of law that the United Kingdom had centuries ago and got rid of centuries ago because it was so arcane and so wasteful. You know, I have the same questions as Colin. I mean, that the Jones Act has stood for 100 years tells me that that interest group has figured something out. And they do have lots of donations, and they have awards that they give. In fact, the Secretary of Transportation, because she got another prestigious award from the union a week or two after she went to the resolute desk and told the president, don't even use the part of the Jones Act that allows for an exception.
Just a moment of commercial interjection. For Colin and everyone else, in July, we did an hour-long forum with Mario Loyola, one of our senior fellows who's written on the Jones Act, and Senator Mike Lee, who's introduced reform proposals. You can find that on YouTube. And same place you'll find this forum after we conclude this afternoon. It also brings to mind the next question, which is about OIRA. And we have another forum earlier in the summer where we featured OIRA Administrator Paul Ray. So lots of good content coming out from CEI, and I want to make sure that we link the audience to other resources. So let me get to the next question here from Richard. Very simple. How closely did you work with OIRA? This is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, with the regulatory czar reference that you made earlier.
I mean, we were working very closely. I mean, they have a lot of problems. And one of the problems is they're managing the agencies, and the agencies are doing a lot of the clerical work around this, but they don't count opportunity costs of regulation. They just count the paperwork costs. And so, you know, they're trying to brag on behalf of the president on how many regulatory costs the president has saved, but they only count the costs they count of these paperwork costs, which are rather trivial on the scale. So you'll see, oh, last year the president saved $2 billion in regulations in an economy that's 20 trillion a year. I mean, it is such a trivial number. And so one thing we try to do is say, you know, opportunity costs, that's our bread and butter. We'll help you. We'll help you come up with another set of estimates that include opportunity costs, and will be much bigger. Turn out to be about 200 times bigger than their estimates. So we were cheerleaders for them, very much cheerleaders from them. Now, we had some headbutting, and we did complain that they don't count opportunity costs. Like with that rebate rule, I complained that, you know, OIRA's own guidance, Circular A4, says that when you're doing price controls, the analysis the agencies proposing it must live up to a higher standard. And I asked, can you just impose any standard on HHS when they propose price controls, let alone a higher standard? And they refused. I mean, that was a battle that I had with them, and they called me some names. In the end, I got along and I liked the people, but that was a point of conflict. At the same time that I viewed ourselves as the biggest supporters of OIRA in the world, this OIRA.
Right. And I think this OIRA is sort of emblematic in a way of government bureaucracy in general. I mean, there are people who work there for many years, and they have a way of doing things, a way of analysis, and it's very hard to get them to change their ways, even when you think you're presenting what seems like a very reasoned argument as to why they ought to do the analysis a little bit differently. And I think, you know, what Casey's describing is that butting of heads. And this is from an administration where there was every intention of trying to change the way the analysis was done so that it was a more rigorous economic analysis.
You discussed their paperwork burdens versus the opportunity costs of new regulation. And that's one of the myths that you explore of regulation in the book. Another myth that you dive into is this notion that regulation is both smart and evidence-based. Why do you say that's a myth?
Well, you have a couple agencies that are engaged in environmental regulation, EPA and Department of Transportation, that actually their regulatory analysis is not terrible. I can cite a lot of ways to improve it, but I can't call it terrible. But then you have the rest of the agencies that just do an awful job, both in terms of not counting opportunity costs. There's that kind of negligence piece. And there's also just willful hiding it. I mean, we have the problem, right, that all this ideas about a regulatory budget and cost benefit analysis, it's self-imposed on the executive branch policing itself. Okay, so Congress needs to get involved here, but they're policing themselves, and of course they let themselves out of jail all the time. So they will do things, and I heard this story from many OIRA veterans. You know, the Obama West Wing would walk a new regulation in that, for example, prohibiting short-term health insurance plans, which was a multi-billion-dollar market, and they'll say this is economically insignificant, period. Therefore, it won't go through the various, you know, scrutiny processes involved. With
So I just want to pause you there to make sure everybody's tracking. The executive branch agencies are required to make a distinction for new rules, whether they're significant or not, and there's a threshold. This is separate from the independent agencies, but these executive branch agencies, they get to decide for themselves whether or not their rule is significant. That's what you're saying was happening for these massive changes yes. Under the Obama health proposals. And it happens across administrations. Everybody does this, right?
Yeah, and I tell the story in the book. I went to a meeting from, I believe it was Commerce, and we had to meet in one of these skiffs, you know, where you can't have your electronic devices, and you know the spies can't hear us and stuff like that. And I was like, geez, I'm gonna miss my iPhone. What's up? Oh, this is really important. And then I go in this meeting, and then they give a talk about how important this is to this industry and that industry. And I say, guys, you're asking us to call this regulation economically insignificant. You just got done telling me I got to be in a secret room and how important this thing is. Which is it, you know? Actually, in that case, it was just me and the director of OIRA who's saying, you know, maybe this thing is significant, but it was ended up being a compromise. There was, I forget the verbiage they used, where some intermediate designation of it's kind of significant or other significant or something like that. So it had to go through some little bit extra scrutiny, but not the full level of scrutiny that a truly significant regulation would have to go through.
I want to talk about a success and then a failure. And then I see we have another question coming in. We'll weave in here about tax rates and wages. But a success, there was just a passing reference to, it's something that we've spent a lot of energy on here at CEI over time, and would continue, we'd like to continue expanding on, and that's regulatory budgeting. Why is this so revolutionary, and why has it been so controversial?
Yeah, the common reaction I got from Cass Sunstein to my colleagues at the University of Chicago was like, we already had a cost-benefit test. Why would you, these well-meaning nonpartisan technocrats, none of whom voted for the president, but put that aside, these well-meaning technocrats, why should they be constrained? They've been told that benefits have to exceed costs. End of story. There's any extra constraints only prohibits them from helping America. That's their view. And one of the replies I make to that is like, well, how come there's no company in this world that's run that way or has been run that way in the last couple of centuries? All the CEOs in this world give a budget to their vice presidents. And they say, go out and maximize profits subject to that budget. And you can't go over budget. And if you think you need more budget, then come back hat in hand and explain why you have this great opportunity to help the company. And that's the same thing a regulatory budget does. It says, you know, you agency, you can't create more than a certain amount of regulatory costs. If you have some great thing to do that needs more regulatory costs, come to the president and plead your case. But that constrains the technocrats. And that's fundamentally, I think, what this president's about, and that's the title. I mean, the president was not elected by the technocrats. He was elected by the people who've been harmed by the technocrats. And this is very much the battle going on. I see this as a common sense check. The technocrats aren't God, they aren't gospel. They need to have some accountability to
the very first step toward a robust and fully functioning regulatory budget is the 2-for-1 rule, where the president instructed through executive order that he wants to see both accounting and a net, if not a balance, a net reduction in this regulatory burden. How would you expand the regulatory budget? What do you think the next phase would be for? Can we bring in the independent agencies? Can we be more rigorous in the cost accounting? What sort of things would be the next on your list of recommendations?
Well, they need to be more rigorous on the cost accounting. The 2-for-1 is a marketing gimmick. It's brilliant because you've all heard of it. So therefore, by definition, it's worked. The real meat there is the cost budget measured in dollars. And now that's only as good as the cost calculations that the agencies make, which I said are terrible for the most part, except for DOT and EPA. So I think you want to improve on that. We made suggestions how to improve on that. Mostly they were suggestions on, by the way, why don't you just follow your own guidance you've had around for years? But they put out a request for comment, or OMB put out a request for comment about accounting for deadweight costs. So if you have a regulation that takes money out of the Treasury, you know, that's not just a transfer, because those aren't lump sum taxes that finance the Treasury. You need to account for the deadweight costs of those taxes, and that's a real shrinking of the economic pie. That's already, there's actually 2 pieces of guidance in OMB that said they're supposed to do that. They don't. And we came in and said, can we please do that? And they put out a request for comment saying, you know, we're thinking about taking our own guidance more seriously going forward. And I think that has real legs because it shoots down a lot of the excuses that we got, that we don't have enough time. You know, it's just a simple multiplication operation. You know, every dollar of Treasury revenue has a certain deadweight cost per dollar, and you just multiply by a number you already have. Multiply 2 numbers you already have, and you put that in the budget. So I think they're going to do that. At least they got to the point of telling the public that this is on their mind.
A question, I think, perhaps for both of you, although it's directed specifically to you, Casey, from Bill. How did your association with the Trump administration affect your standing in the professional community, as well as the social lives of yourself or your family in these hyper-partisan times? And then implicit assumption here, was the price you must have paid worth it? Joel, you first, and then we'll go to Casey.
Well, my family still speaks to me, so that's helpful. My daughter, who is actually an undergraduate at Casey's institution, University of Chicago, I don't think goes out of her way to make my association with the Trump administration widely known. However, she like many conservatives or conservative students these days has to, I think, to some extent, self-censor. I will say that within the medical community, even though physicians in general are relatively conservative, I think physicians have fallen under the sort of hysteria and misinformation that's out there about many of the things that are going on in the Trump administration. And that's become very apparent in the approach to the pandemic. I mean, the fact of the matter is the administration took some of the recommendations we had in our CEA pandemic report to use public-private partnerships. And as a result, they've ended up with vaccines and new therapeutics in record times. Things that normally take many, many years and tens of billions of dollars are now in the final stage of testing after about 6-7 months. So, but you'd never know that if you talk to many of my colleagues. And the sort of mantra about follow the science is widely extant in the medical community because they think the science is clear when every indication is that in dealing with the pandemic, the science has not been clear and is still evolving. So the fact that I worked at the Trump administration has been a problem with some of my professional relationships, but I will say there are probably about 20-25% of my colleagues will pull me aside and say, you know, that was great that you worked there. Thanks for doing that.
And Casey, how was your reception in the faculty lounge when you came home to Chicago?
You know, early on, I was one of the first weeks I was back. I was asked to kind of give a speech or something, a talk, and there I kind of established the tone of, you know, you guys who work for Obama or Bush or Clinton, you had a chance to look at the opioid epidemic. You had a chance to look at pandemics. You had a chance to look at homelessness. And I can see the written record of CEA over all those years. You didn't do any of those things. And we did it. And we did it in a short period of time. We did it well. And then that kind of puts them back on their heels. And then we talk about it, and they're very interested in, oh, what do you learn about opioids? Oh, the price of opioids went down by a factor of 5 or 10. Wow, maybe that has something to do with why more opioids are consumed. You know, that, so a lot of them are genuinely interested in the facts, and they're not going to vote for the president, and sometimes their president drives them completely nuts, but they are interested in hearing what's really happening. And that's kind of what the readers of the book enjoy as well. There's all kinds of things that the New York Times hasn't told them that they find interesting. And I know them, so I'm kind of a good guesser at what they'll find interesting.
I have a question here from our old friend, Tom Hazlett, for you, Casey. He writes, theoretically, how was the reduction in the corporate tax rate expected to affect U.S. wages? And how has market evidence gleaned since the tax cut compared to the prediction?
Yeah, so there are two theoretical channels that we emphasize. One is the obvious, you know, you have, when you tax investment, you get less investment, and that's less demand for labor ultimately. It doesn't happen overnight, but over a period of a few years, that's what you get. That's one channel. And the other channel is that the corporate sector is just a part of the economy. You have a big non-corporate business sector, and the corporate tax was distorting that margin. And so that may look more like a productivity effect, that we're allocating better between corporate and non-corporate, also between business and housing, better allocation there. Housing had sucked up a lot of the investment capital because of its big tax differential with business, which some is still there. So that's kind of theoretically how it works. The first report I wrote was about wage growth. And we went back and revisited the wage data, you know, doing some of the basic human capital type of calculations, selection effects, and those very off the shelf. Again, is another example we just took off the shelf labor economics publications, and we updated them to include the Obama years and the Trump years. And we found that there was a lot of wage growth going on. We wrote that report in 2018. There was even more wage growth in 2019. I think in 2019, it became more apparent that the wage growth tended to be disproportionate on blue collar type of jobs, which is kind of what you would expect. That some of the capital intensity issues would be more important for them than for white collar type of jobs. So the initial evidence looked good. The theory says it's a long run process, so I think we want to keep revisiting that data. But I think that's clear how it works. My friend Krugman gets very confused on this. He thinks that if there's monopolies in the corporate sector, these two effects don't apply, which is wrong, in fact, backwards. The taxes can do more damage when they go on top of a monopoly distortion than when they go on top of a competitive market. So that's the theory, and I want to go back and look at new evidence as it comes out.
So I think we might have time for just one more kind of big topic before we start to wrap up. There's something that happened at the CEA that I think is quite remarkable. I've been looking at the annual reports, well, at least since graduate school, when they first came to my attention from a professor who told me that this is the most clear economic writing I would find from government anywhere, which was a pretty good recommendation. You tackled socialism. Why was that necessary? And how did that report of the CEA work its way into the day-to-day activities of the president and his senior advisors? I think that was quite remarkable because most CEA analysis is on specific policies or specific industries. So why something as big and far-reaching as socialism?
Well, I think it made a comeback. I had observed that before I got into CEA. And let me be clear what I mean by socialism. The idea that profits are morally wrong, the idea that profits are just theft, glorified, legalized theft from workers and from customers. That idea is making a comeback. It is in major legislation and is sitting in Congress right now, such as Medicare for All says that explicitly. And we know something about that. Again, there's a long empirical literature on countries that have tried to abolish profits in various ways, eliminate private business ownership. And I thought it was a good time to collect that together. I think if you look at the president's mention of socialism in speeches and Twitters and stuff like that, I believe it's zero, exactly zero until the summer of 2018 when that report was on its way to the presses. And then the president hasn't let up on it since. So, and I think it was helpful because we could begin that conversation about socialism with data and facts and the academic, definitions of words and things like that, so that the president's conversation was grounded in something, rather than, he doesn't get a lot of critiques on how he uses the term socialism and what it refers to because it's grounded in that.
I think, Penny, that was a very useful report for the way it informed a lot of other CEA efforts. So when we did the health policy chapter in the economic report of the president, we looked at could markets work in healthcare? And we went right back to some of the original articles, the famous Kenneth Arrow article, which is often misconstrued and misquoted, and said there were issues with competition, but markets could work. And then said, well, what are policies that are more socialistic and don't believe in markets? And we could then look, based on Casey's work, at Medicare for All, and then compare them with some initiatives that the Trump administration was pushing forward to increase competition and allow markets to work.
Yeah, I also think one thing that helped, crystallize for the political people, the choice and competition. Again, I give Brian Price a heck of a lot of credit for that report and that title. When there are problems in society, and we do have real problems, the president's opponents are often, their reaction is to reduce competition. There shall be one payer. Single payer means no competition. Last I checked, single means one. And the president, a lot of his regulatory efforts around not just health, but so many industries was, why don't we have more sellers? Why we need more sellers, more buyers, more competition. So that really crystallized, I think, a real distinction in their policy outlooks, not just the verbiage around it. We can call it socialist and all that, but these are real differences when you approach a market and try to fix it by having less competition versus more.
Well, I want to give you a chance to answer the question that I usually lead with when we do these author conversations, book talks. Just real quickly, if a reader has to, take this book into a cocktail conversation or visit with a family member next month around the Thanksgiving table, what is it that you want people to take away from your book? Is there a single lesson or a main point that you want to make sure to convey to our audience?
I like the way Joel put it, which is a lot of light bulbs turn on, I think, in your brain when you realize how the method to the madness, what Joel called it, but there's not really madness. It actually makes sense. There's a simple framework that explains what the president is doing. And I think that framework begins and is grounded with where he came from. He came from, not from the technocrats. His support came from flyover country. And given that that's where you're coming from, what are the constraints you have and how are you going to approach policy and politics, I think flow pretty naturally. And the president has followed that natural progression. And a lot of what he does makes a lot of sense from that perspective.
Very good. Joel, any final words before I take us out with some administrative details?
Buy the book. It's a very entertaining read, and it's even entertaining for people who are there. I learned an awful lot of stuff from it, and I think anyone who buys it and reads it will too.
Very good. Buy the book. You're Hired by Casey Mulligan. Clear writing on how economics affects the economic way of thinking and economic analysis affects policymaking at the White House, at least during the 2018-2019 window. There's good lessons about how there is a regulatory impulse that when a problem is identified, rather than understanding perhaps the regulatory problem that caused the initial problem, the agencies try to paper it over with yet another layer of regulation. There's all sorts of good insights about moving policy through the process. I want to thank you both for being with us. I want to encourage the audience to join us in that conversation about how we're doing and the sort of programs that you'd like to see. So you should see a short survey pop up on your screen in just one moment. And then a reminder, we'll be back next week on Wednesday for another in our series of Repeal for Resilience. We'll be looking at the Centers for Disease Control and mission creep. There's a new lawsuit that I'm very encouraged by, brought by the National Civil Liberties Alliance. Attorney Caleb Kruckenberg will be one of our speakers, looking at an executive order limiting the ability of property owners to have honest and transparent contract conversations between landlords and renters. This is a rule that comes out with the imprint of the CDC, and therefore we'll also have CEI's own Sam Kasman and Michelle Minton, Senior Fellow Michelle Minton, to talk about mission creep at the CDC. All of that's next Wednesday, the 28th. Thank you both, and we'll see you on YouTube, if not at a Zoom forum soon.